September 12, 2025. At 12:25 a.m., at the Primorsk oil port on the Baltic coast, two massive Shadow Fleet tankers were quietly waiting to load millions of barrels of oil. Suddenly, an unprecedented anomaly appeared on the screen of a Nebo-M long-range VHF radar station hundreds of kilometers to the south. Exactly more than 70 unidentified signals with low radar cross-sections were heading toward Russian airspace. The source of these signals extended up to 1,000 kilometers, and their potential payload totaled over 3 tons of high explosives. At the Leningrad Oblast Air Defense Command Center, sirens began to wail when the data was confirmed by the 91N6E Big Bird wide-area surveillance radar. The foundations for this operation were laid months earlier in a planning room in Kiev. However, the 1,000-kilometer range was a problem in itself. But the real obstacle was the Russian air defense network, known even by NATO standards as an anti-access area denial A2/AD bubble, which was deployed along this entire range. Russian generals were calm. This was precisely the moment their systems were designed for. Russia's 3-layered, integrated air defense network kicked in flawlessly. The 92N6E gravestone engagement radars of the S-400 batteries around St. Petersburg began locking onto targets one by one. At lower altitudes, Pantsir S-1 batteries met approaching targets with a wall of steel, unleashing the hellish fire of twin 2A38M 30mm cannons capable of firing 5,000 rounds per minute into the sky. However, the chaos the Russians witnessed was not a random attack. It was a massive, geographically precise deception plan. To draw the Russian defense umbrella away from Primorsk, waves of decoys were specifically directed at the villages of Sevolosk, Tosno, Pokrovskoye, and Uzmino, as well as the Lomonosov district in Leningrad Oblast. At the same time, the districts of Volosovsky, Tosnensky, Gachinsky, Lomonosovsky, and Pushkinsky in St. Petersburg were also targeted, completely drawing the attention of the most powerful S-400 batteries. In an air defense shelter in Gachinsky, a young Russian lieutenant, seeing the last target in his sector disappear from his screen, passed his routine report to the command center. "Sector clear, all targets destroyed." This report, as it climbed up the chain of command, led the generals to the biggest mistake of their careers. What they thought was victory was actually a trap. For this complex plan, more than 70 drones were assigned to the Leningrad and St. Petersburg region. Of these, 35 AQ-400 Scythes were tasked with luring St. Petersburg. The remaining 40 drones formed the main force that would spread across the Leningrad Oblast. At the heart of this force were 15 UJ-26 Bober ERs, tasked with attacking the port of Primorsk. The success of the plan depended on some of the 40 drones heading for Leningrad overcoming this hellish wall of fire and reaching their target. The adequacy of every element was critical for the technical implementation of this plan. The UJ-26 Bober ER drones that made up the assassination squad were specially selected for this mission. The range of standard Bober drones was insufficient for this mission. The ER, extended range versions, however, were the only kamikaze platforms in the Ukrainian inventory capable of completing a 1,000-kilometer one-way flight with a 40-kilogram warhead, thanks to additional fuel tanks and optimized engine software. A similar solution was developed for the electronic warfare (EW) platforms, dubbed Banshee 7, which served in a support role. The range of standard EW drones was insufficient to accompany the assassination squad along the route. Therefore, the Banshee 7 platforms were also built on the same long-range body as the Bober ER, carrying advanced jamming pods and additional antennas instead of explosive payloads. Their mission was to escort the Bober drones to the target, i.e. for 1,000 kilometers. The reason for choosing the AQ-400 Scythe as bait was its simplicity. Its plywood body not only provided a low radar signature, but also facilitated mass production. Hundreds of drones needed for a saturation attack could thus be produced quickly and cheaply. At midnight, more than 70 drones took off from different points in Ukraine and began infiltrating Russia at low altitude. The first few hours passed in absolute radio silence, tracking the terrain. Using preloaded digital terrain maps, the drones followed riverbeds and forested areas, staying below the coverage range of the main Russian radar networks. This was a major test for each drone's autonomous navigation systems. Several drones were lost during this challenging flight, either crashing into the terrain or suffering technical failures. This was an accepted casualty from the outset of the plan. Once they crossed the Russian border, the rules of the game changed. They no longer had to hide, they had to manage. When the Russian air defense network woke up, it reacted exactly as Ukraine had expected. When the 91 N6E Big Bird radars detected this massive but scattered swarm coming from hundreds of kilometers away, the system automatically prioritized the cluster it perceived as the greatest threat. The 35 Syves heading for St. Petersburg. The massive 48 N6 series missiles, launched from S-400 launchers, hunted down these cheap plywood targets one by one. For the Russians, this was flawless defense. For the Ukrainians, it was the first pawn sacrifice on the chessboard. Meanwhile, the other 40 drones scattered across the Leningrad Oblast countryside began a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Pantsir and BUK systems. A Pantsir S-1 battery near Volosovsky locked onto a low-flying UJ-26 Bober. The Pantsir's 1RS-2-1E tracking radar had captured the target flawlessly. The Russian operator could see all the target's telemetry data on the fire control screen. However, the Ukrainian operator could also see the signal from that radar locked onto the Bober on his own screen. He remained calm, because a nearby Banshee 7 had already made its countermove. The Banshee detected the Pantsir's X-band frequency and emitted such a powerful jamming signal on the same frequency that the Russian operator's screen instantly went completely white. The lock was broken. As a last resort, the operator fired the two A-38M 30mm cannons, but Bober had already slipped through the barrage of fire and disappeared into the darkness. This scenario played out repeatedly that night. The Russians were stubborn, and their firepower was high. Towards the center of Leningrad, they managed to crash a total of 33 drones into the ground in a hail of fire and metal. All those heading towards the center of St. Petersburg had been destroyed. However, this was a planned loss for Ukraine. Each drone that fell opened a door for another one coming from behind to slip through. Because as that lieutenant passed his report, from the blind spot created by all this fire and noise, an assassination squad consisting of only 7 specially modified UJ-26 Bober ER drones had breached the main line of defense. These 7 drones would soon plunge surgical scalpels, each carrying a 40-kilogram armor-piercing warhead, into the economic heart of Russia. The Russian generals were looking only at the corner of a huge canvas shown to them and were about to miss the whole picture. It was 4:45 a.m. The Primorsk port's own Pantsir battery was startled when 7 small signals appeared on its screen and rapidly approached, catching it off guard. In a panic, it opened fire, and 57 E-6 missiles left the launchers. But the targets were too low, too fast, and too close. The 7 Bober drones split into 2 groups, with a final maneuver over the port. 3 headed for the pumping station, the heart of the port. The Pantsir's missiles caught one of the trio in the air, just a few hundred meters from its target. But that was the Russians' last consolation that night. The remaining 2 Bober drones dove to complete their mission. The first drone, carrying a TBG-7V thermobaric warhead, struck the station's main control building. The explosion consumed all the oxygen in the enclosed space, creating a massive pressure wave that blew the building's walls outward. A few seconds later, the second drone dove into the main pipeline manifold. The explosion severed the port's lifelines. At the same time, the remaining 4 Bober drones locked onto 2 tankers waiting at the pier. The first 2 headed for the Kapitan Lobov. The first drone, carrying a KZ-6-shaped explosive, struck just below the ship's bridge, destroying all the electronic systems inside. The second drone struck one of the main cargo tanks filled with oil, starting a massive fire. The other 2 Bober drones targeted the Sergei Gorshkov. The strikes were nearly identical. One targeted the ship's engine room, the other the loading manifolds. 4 of the UAVs struck 2 Aframax-class tankers belonging to the Shadow Fleet, named Kusto and Kai-Yun. Kusto was a carrier vessel managed by Solstice Corp, with a deadweight tonnage, DWT, of 115,000. Kai-Yun was another Aframax tanker, registered to Axaronix Limited and operating with a DWT of 110,000. Both were listed under suspicious flags in the international insurance market's maritime shipping registers. At the time of the attack, both tankers were at the loading line, and when the drones arrived, loading was about to be completed. That's when the fire started. The scale of the fire was not military but strategic, because because the point of impact was not just storage tanks, but also the heart of the shipping stations. Just 42 seconds after the first explosion, the second one occurred, and Primorsk port's number 2 pumping station collapsed. The third drone pierced the upper facade of the port's control center. With a short circuit, the entire port went into emergency shutdown mode. However, this shutdown command did not pass through the system because the core of the energy control system had also been hit. The fourth and fifth drones targeted the loading arms at the stern of the tankers. A fire broke out on the Kusto, and fuel began leaking from the Kaiyun. The sixth and seventh drone attacks were in the area of the pump valves, and after these attacks, it was no longer possible to control the fire. Primorsk was evaporating. Within minutes, the port of Primorsk resembled hell, with 2 massive burning tankers and a devastated pumping station. Hours after the attack, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that 221 Ukrainian drones had been shot down across the country overnight, and that all attacks had been successfully repelled. However, these figures were meaningless compared to satellite images from Primorsk showing billions of dollars in damage. The targets were not random. Primorsk alone accounted for approximately 20% of Russia's oil exports by sea. The targeted Aframax-class tankers, each with a capacity of approximately 700,000 barrels of oil, were key vessels in the Shadow Fleet used to circumvent sanctions. The port of Primorsk facilitated an annual oil export value of $15 billion. The oil in Primorsk is the gateway for barrel-based oil shipments that are difficult to track and even harder to control, sold to international shadow fleets. And closing this gateway directly affects Russia's war fund. The average daily shipment of 1 million barrels of oil, this translates to a daily loss of approximately $70 to $80 million. At that time, St. Petersburg's Pulkovo Airport triggered its cover plan. 11 aircraft were diverted to alternative airports. That same morning, numerous UAVs entering the airspace simultaneously pushed civil-military air traffic management into crisis mode. When the safety reflex kicked in first from the radar and tower perspective, operations automatically broke down. Data from the Leningrad Regional Administration and the airport operator was also passed on to Russian state agencies. A cluttered screen over St. Petersburg. UAV wreckage shot down in the Leningrad countryside, parts falling outside residential areas. All of this kept the operator's attention focused upward, while the striking wave coming from the sea horizon locked onto the terminal. From a technical standpoint, Ukraine's long-range UAV concept achieved 3 things in this mission. First, it did not allow for range calculation errors. When the strike types of the UAVs were analyzed, it became clear that 2 different classes were used. These UAVs were designed to deceive Russian radars. Russian systems were optimized to stop a small number of high-tech targets. Ukraine's swarm tactic overwhelmed the system's decision-making mechanism with target saturation. The success of EW platforms such as the Banshee 7 was not to completely blind the radars, but to present them with so many false targets and interference that Russian operators could no longer distinguish the real threat. Traces of such systems were found among the drone parts captured